Well, it has certainly been an exciting couple of days on the campaign trail with a lot of different things happening. Uh, Let me say, I hope all of us will keep Hillary Clinton in our prayers. I hope she gets better. I've known her for 24 years. And it's important to remember that while we may be competitors, we're not enemies. We're all Americans. And we should never wish anybody bad health. So I hope that everything works out all right for her. However, Friday, when she spoke Friday night, she, apparently the written text, had a very, very strong statement, which I want to spend a little time on. And I want to talk a little bit about the idea of being deplorable and about the inherent dishonesty in being liberal in America today. So let me start first with deplorable, because I thought it was a fascinating experience to both see her say it, that half of the Trump supporters are deplorable, and then she had a list of how she was defining the Trump supporters. And to me, what was the most interesting was the reaction of the audience. It was clearly a left-wing, elitist group of snobs who were looking down on normal Americans and who were delighted to have a chance to call them nasty names. So Hillary talked about racist. I actually wrote it down to make sure I got it right. Racist, sexist, homophobic, xenophobic, and Islamophobic. It is fascinating because here you have in Donald Trump the Republican candidate who has been the most open in reaching out to help African Americans of any candidate I can remember in a very long time. Going to Milwaukee with Sheriff Clark, who, by the way, is African American, and talking about what needs to be done in what is the sixth poorest city in America, the city of Milwaukee. Going to Detroit to an African American church, and then with Dr. Ben Carson visiting his home neighborhood, looking at the problems that have hit Detroit. There will be another series of meetings in the very near future. There have been meetings in New York and elsewhere with African American leaders. You've had Trump again and again talk about the concern of helping every American of every background have a chance to get a job, to be safe, to have physical health. It's amazing because the reaction on the left, of course, is that they can't debate their policies. They can't defend one person being shot every 2 hours in Chicago, which is this year's rate. They can't defend more people having been killed, more Americans having been killed in Chicago since Barack Obama was sworn in, than have died in Iraq and Afghanistan in the same period. They can't defend a Detroit school system in which 7% of the students, I think in the 8th grade, are able to read fluently. They can't defend the disasters in Milwaukee, as I said earlier, now the 6th poorest city in the country. They can't defend the Baltimore school system, in which 13% of the 8th graders pass their exams in math and in English. So they've got to scream racist, because if it becomes acceptable for African Americans to reach out and talk about why are these policies failing? Why are these bureaucracies failing? How did Rudy Giuliani reduce the murder rate in New York City by 85%? And why aren't we applying that to Chicago or St. Louis or Baltimore, places that have very, very high murder rates? All of a sudden, if you're on the left, you're indefensible. You can't possibly explain and defend the failures of your policies, your ideology, and your bureaucracies. So you scream racist and hope that people will be reminded they're not allowed to think about voting Republican. They're not allowed to think about voting for Donald Trump, because if they do think about it, they might do it. I met an African American last night, a gentleman who was flying to Washington. I was in Atlanta yesterday, and we were chatting. He actually had a Donald Trump yard sign. And I asked him, what are you doing in the airport with a yard sign? And he said his name is Amon. And he lives in Northeast Washington. He said, I carry it everywhere I go. He said, you'd be amazed the conversations that start. And we chatted a little bit longer. And he said, I served in the U.S. Army. And I think I earned the right to carry the sign I want to, and I want to carry a Trump sign. And I said, why? He said, I was born in South Carolina. My two parents worked in the textile mills. When NAFTA destroyed the textile industry, they lost their jobs. So I agree with Trump that we have had a really rigged system of trade. He said, furthermore, I now have two young men who are in college, and I want my sons to have a chance to go get a job. I think with Trump, they have a pretty good chance to go get a job. I think with Clinton, they're going to end up living at home with me because they're not going to have any jobs. So I have a really big interest in making sure we have somebody who focuses on jobs. And he said, when I take my Trump sign down to the barbershop to get a haircut, it leads to some really wild conversations. And I got a picture with him. We posted it last night, and he went merrily on his way. Now, he was the reason that people like Hillary Clinton have to scream racist, because if he's allowed to continue talking to his neighbors, and he's allowed to actually convince people that it's okay to consider an alternative, the entire Democratic machine falls apart. If they lose 20% of the African American vote, they can't win. If the average African American decides Donald Trump is not a threat, they won't be able to scare them into turning out. They're not going to turn out for Hillary Clinton for positive reasons. They know that she and her husband have been around since the 1992 presidential race. Think of it. For 24 years, she's been around promising and promising and promising. Promising as First Lady, promising as U.S. Senator, promising as Secretary of State, promising twice as a presidential candidate. And if you live in inner city Milwaukee or Baltimore or Chicago or Detroit, you know the Democrats have not delivered. You know your neighborhood is dangerous, there aren't any jobs, the schools don't work, and all your local leaders can do is scream racist because they can't defend themselves. Second, sexist. This is a delicate area for me because, after all, I'm a 73-year-old guy, and who am I to dispute a woman who says that sexism is a problem? But I have to confess, I found it a little strange when Hillary the other day explained to us that when she went to take the LSATs, the law scholastic aptitude tests, 45, 48 years ago, that she felt bothered by some of the boys or men that were in the room. Now, she went on from there to become a lawyer. I graduated from Yale. She went on to become the First Lady of Arkansas. She went on to become a partner in the Rose Law Firm. She went on to become a U.S. Senator from New York. She went on to become a Secretary of State. She's now in her second presidential campaign. But apparently, deep in the back of her mind, there's this memory of that terrible day when several guys said nasty things to her. Now, you would think there's a point she'd get over it, but she carries these things. So the other night, when Matt Lauer failed to protect her, and she did terribly in the national security debate, one of the accusations was he was a sexist because he didn't treat her fairly. And so Hillary sets up this double standard where you're supposed to think she's a tough professional, but anything somebody does that she doesn't like is proof they're a sexist. You watch the 3 debates she has with Trump, whether or not she runs and hides behind the shield and says, he was mean to me, he wasn't being nice. And you have to ask yourself, I mean, how would you deal with Putin if you were that sensitive? How would you deal with the head of China if you were that sensitive? But there's a deeper part to the racism and sexism and homophobia. The Clinton Foundation has never had problems taking money from dictatorships that execute gays. They've never had trouble taking money from countries that discriminate deeply against women. You see, as long as you have the cash, why, you're okay. And the Clintons need you, and you can be their friend. Just bring a big enough check. So I think what you're seeing here is you're going to have tonight Donald Trump give a very important speech about child care, something which his daughter Ivanka has worked on personally, because as a 34-year-old working mother, she realizes that average families need more help with their children than they're getting. He's going to propose some very serious tax breaks for families. But of course, we all know that Hillary Clinton believes Donald Trump is a sexist. So we have to think, what's the hidden problem with him actually trying to help families and trying to help working mothers? Because the Democrats have to find a hidden problem or they won't be able to defend themselves. Homophobia. Let me suggest to you that the degree to which the left relies on paranoia, this is, after all, a country which has, over the last 50 years, undergone a revolution in rights for gays, lesbians, and has enabled people of a wide range of sexual backgrounds to have a level of freedom unlike any other country in the modern world. And yet there's this underlying paranoia. And the question you have to ask yourself again is, when you look at where the Clintons take money from the Clinton Foundation, and you look at literally countries that execute gays, and yet the Clintons work with them. You look at the Iranian experience where they execute gays. They executed one young lady for having held hands with a man she wasn't married to. And yet we're sending billions of dollars to the Iranian dictatorship under a policy that Hillary supports. So it's a very strange double standard. Xenophobia, fear of foreigners. Well, I have a PhD in European history. As a child, when my dad served in the army, I lived in France and Germany. I went back as a graduate student and lived in Belgium. I have traveled all over Europe endlessly. As many of you know who follow me on Facebook, recently Calista and I were in Spain, France, and Italy. But there are some foreigners I'm afraid of. I don't want ISIS to come to the U.S. I don't want the Taliban to come to the U.S. I don't want Boko Haram to come to the U.S. Is that fear of foreigners or is that common sense? Being afraid of grizzly bears doesn't mean you're nuts. It may mean that you know what grizzly bears are. But the left can't deal with this. The left can't even describe accurately the threats to our society. So they have to be in favor of policies that are utterly out of touch with reality. And since they can't defend their policies, they have to scream that we must be xenophobic, we must be Islamophobic. I'm not worried about Muslims in general. I'm worried about those Muslims who declare publicly that they want to kill us. I think that's frankly a pretty reasonable thing to be afraid of. I'm worried about people who are trying to get a nuclear weapon so they can set it off in an American city. I'm worried about people who put on their websites that they're going to conquer Rome. These are very specific threats from very specific people, which no one on the left can even deal with. Which gets me to the final part, which is dishonesty. Because liberals can't tell the truth and win. Remember Barack Obama? You get to keep your doctor. That was a lie. You get to keep your insurance policy. That was a lie. We have not spent any money for hostages. $400 million went in an airplane in unmarked bills, looking like it was from Lethal Weapons as a movie. Again and again and again, the president simply doesn't tell the truth. Now you get to Hillary Clinton, who is in the same tradition. It's not that Hillary, while she's more dishonest, she's not out of the tradition. You know, the White House staff sat down during Benghazi and they decided, we now know this, they decided in a very deliberate way that they couldn't tell the truth about the attack that killed the American ambassador because it would have undermined Obama's re-election. So they decided to lie to the American people, calmly, methodically, efficiently. Think about that. Think about the cold-heartedness of Hillary Clinton saying to the mother of one of the dead young Americans that this was all caused by a movie, which she knew was a lie. She had already written an email to her own daughter saying this was caused by a terrorist group. But they're so used to lying, which frankly gets you around to how they've handled the last few days. They didn't tell us she had pneumonia on Friday because why would you? They have no obligation to tell the truth. They just had the person who installed their server refuse to testify to Congress, refused to even show up, because why should he? They have given us several different versions of what happened on Sunday. Initially it was dehydration, then it was pneumonia. The Secret Service clearly broke its own protocol. It was supposed to take her to a hospital. It was instructed not to, making you wonder, why was she afraid to see an independent doctor? What did she think those doctors and nurses might discover that she didn't want the rest of us to know? So the automatic habit of lying is now so deep that they do it all the time about almost everything. And I think that is the hallmark. First, they lie about you. Then they smear you with harsh words. Then they come back and lie about the issue. And that, tragically, is what modern liberalism has degenerated into. And that's what you're seeing day after day as you watch this campaign. Now, we have a few questions here. We have a brand new technique where we actually have Audrey Bird typing it, so I don't have to try to read her writing. This is quite impressive. Margie B., do you think her slip in polls is due to deplorables comment or health secrecy? I think she is slipping in the polls because there's a continuous, unending, day after day revelation of things that are just wrong. Whether it is the Clinton Foundation's ruthless, heartless exploitation of Haitians, whether it is the people they get money from, whether it is her lies about emails, every time you turn around there's some new problem. And I think the drip, 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 drip of dishonesty is starting to just plain catch up with her. Dorothy Dickens, has there always been this level of corruption in our government? And if not, was there a turning point that began to lead us towards such corruption? We've had a couple of periods of significant corruption. I would say that the Grant administration in the 1860s, where they ultimately had to lock up a bunch of cabinet officers. Harding's administration in the early 1920s, where they had to lock up a bunch of cabinet officers. I mean, there have been cases. But part of what's happened is government's just gotten to be so massive. It has so much money. It's so much more tempting to steal from. And there's been a much greater increase in willingness to be corrupt and dishonest. Many more people are willing to cheat today, whether it's for disability or for Medicaid cards or for food stamps, or the big boys who cheat to get solar power grants or who cheat to get special deals. And the result is that you do have a culture of corruption that's very real. I've been looking at this stuff since August of 1958, when we were stationed in Europe. And I have to say, having served as a congressman, having served as Speaker of the House, I believe the system has grown steadily more corrupt. It accelerated to some extent under Bill Clinton, but the really deep acceleration, I think, has been in the last 8 years under Obama. The number of special deals, the number of special favors, the amount of government money given away is just breathtaking. And it's one of the reasons I believe so deeply that we need somebody who's outside the system, who's prepared to really clean it up. This is all compounded by the government employee unions and by the civil service bureaucracy, which can't be fired. So you can be dishonest, you can be corrupt, you can actually be convicted of breaking the law, and yet we can't do anything to get rid of you. And I think the biggest single challenge to a Trump administration will be to return the civil service to a meritocracy where if you break the law, if you're dishonest, if you don't do your job, you get replaced. And that'll be the biggest fight. Leonard Spiker, why won't the federal government bring charges against Hillary Clinton or James Comey? Well, I mean, James Comey shouldn't get charges. He's the FBI director. You know, I was a little impressed with Comey's presentation when he first made it. But when I saw the timeline of when subpoenas were issued and when they began destroying her 13 mobile devices and when they began erasing her emails, I really think this is profoundly wrong. You have never seen a more clear case of obstruction of justice than what we've gone through with Hillary Clinton. And if you take everything from destroying the instruments to destroying the emails to lying about it to members of her staff taking the, refusing to testify, to the weird Saturday interview where her chief of staff was there as her lawyer, even though her chief of staff was also a witness. The whole thing is just strange. And whether that's because Comey was ordered by the Obama administration to take a dive, or whatever the reason, it's really striking the more you look at it, that she was not indicted and that her whole senior staff wasn't indicted, because they all broke the law. They all lied. And it's just unequivocal. It is absolutely, totally true. So we're going to come back. I'm going to deal with more of this in the near future. But I did want to take a few minutes to talk to you about where we're at and to put in context why they applauded the concept of deplorable, to point out to you how totally phony their use of these harsh words is, and to remind you that dishonesty is the only defense the left has, because if it's honest, it's going to be crushed, and therefore they can't tell us the truth. And I look forward to having a chance to share ideas with you again. And remember, every week I do 2 newsletters at gingrichproductions.com that you can get for free if you'd like to. And today's is actually on the deplorables and dishonesty. So if you go to gingrichproductions.com, you can sign up for the newsletters.